So Prince William and Princess Catherine are reportedly in tears on camera, and the reason they're giving for keeping Prince Louis out of the public eye is that an 8-year-old started believing his own family was ashamed of him, not because of a health scare, not because of a security threat, not because of some complicated royal protocol, but because the silence itself got so loud that a little kid filled in the blanks with the worst possible answer. That's the core of this story, and honestly, the more you look at the timeline and the way this was handled, the more confusing the whole thing gets. Before we get into it, if you're into royal deep dives and palastrala that actually makes sense when you slow it down, hit subscribe to Crown Watch. It helps the channel more than you know, and we're covering this stuff regularly. Okay, let's get into it. So the big moment people are talking about is Catherine sitting down in front of a camera with a prepared statement in front of her, which is how the palace does everything. Every word is vetted, every sentence is cleared, every pause is probably rehearsed. That's not a criticism. That's just how Kensington Palace operates. They've been doing it this way for over a decade. So when Catherine reportedly looked at the pages, paused, and then placed them face down on the table, that's already a significant departure. And then she starts speaking from the heart about Prince Louis, no notes, no approved lines, no warning to the communications team. About 2/3 of the way through, while talking about her youngest son, she gets emotional. Tears in her eyes, voice still going, not stopping, not asking to pause, just speaking through it. And that's the detail that makes it feel real, because if you've ever watched someone try to hold it together while they're talking about their kid, you know how much harder that is to watch than if they just broke down completely. Now, the palace has spent years building a very specific image around these three children. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis appear in public only a handful of times a year. Christmas at Sandringham, the Buckingham Palace balcony, maybe a carefully selected sporting event, and photos taken by Catherine herself. That's been the strategy since George was born in 2013. It's not a new thing, it's a 10-year plan, as the Scottish Daily Express described it, to give them as normal a life as possible. And when you look at the history, you understand why Prince William is so intense about this. He was 15 years old, walking behind his mother's coffin in front of millions of people. And then immediately after Princess Diana's death, her private letters were published, her handwriting was examined, her clothes were displayed and sold, recordings of her voice that she never intended for anyone else to hear became public. William saw all of that happen in real time as a teenager. So when he says he wants his children to have privacy, he's not being difficult or secretive for no reason. He's responding to something deeply traumatic that he's never fully gotten over. That part of the story is completely understandable. But here's where it gets weird. Over the last several months, Prince Louis started disappearing from public events. Not just a couple of times, but consistently, events that had been penciled into the family calendar quietly disappeared. 2 family occasions he had attended in previous years went ahead without him. No explanation was given. The palace's response to reporters was the same short, polite line about family privacy. And at first, people accepted that. But then the months kept adding up, and royal watchers started counting. Once people start counting how long it's been since they've seen an 8-year-old, the rumors begin. And that's the irony of the whole situation. The strategy designed to prevent speculation ended up creating way more of it. Because when you remove all information, people don't stop asking questions. They just start making up their own answers. William's first reaction, according to the claims, was to shut everything down, cancel every public event involving Louis, refuse to discuss the situation, and make it clear that missing royal engagements didn't matter if it meant protecting his son. Which again, any parent would understand, but the senior advisors in the palace reportedly warned him that this approach would backfire. And they had a very specific reason for saying that. Back in 2024, when Catherine disappeared from public duties for a period of time without much explanation, the silence created a vacuum. And that vacuum got filled with wild theories, some of them genuinely harmful, before the palace finally explained what was actually going on with her health. The advisors weren't asking William to expose his son or reveal private family matters. They were asking for a short general statement that would give the press office something to point to, instead of saying nothing at all. And from a purely strategic perspective, that makes sense. When there's no official explanation, people create their own. And once that happens, the family loses control of the narrative entirely. But William stood firm. Month after month, he refused every suggestion. He wouldn't allow Lewis's situation to become a public discussion while his son was still confused and frightened. And here's the part that's genuinely sad. The silence started affecting the entire household. George, who was 13 at the time, became quieter, more careful, more responsible. He was old enough to know something was wrong, but too young to fully understand what was happening. Charlotte, who was 11, noticed every closed door, every conversation that shifted when she walked into a room, every adult who suddenly found a reason to leave. She put the pieces together on her own, and she came surprisingly close to understanding the truth. But instead of making it about herself, she started leaving handwritten jokes beside Lewis's bed, not just once, but repeatedly. She figured out that making him laugh even for a few minutes brought back the brother she knew, and later, after overhearing household staff talking about the growing public attention, she went to her mother and asked if strangers were worried about Louis. Then she asked a question that no 11-year-old should have to ask. Is Louis going to have to answer all of them? That's a kid carrying emotional weight she should never have been carrying, and it happened because nobody explained enough. She filled in the missing pieces herself. Meanwhile, Catherine was barely sleeping, carrying fears she didn't want William to see. And William was doing the exact same thing, hiding his own worries because he wanted to protect Catherine. Neither of them realized they had both stopped talking honestly about how they truly felt. Long periods of stress don't always lead to loud arguments. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens at all. There are no angry words, no obvious distance. Instead, kindness slowly becomes quieter, conversations become shorter, feelings stay hidden. Before long, they were living under the same roof while quietly carrying separate burdens. And right in the middle of all this was 8-year-old Louis, who was far too young to understand how the royal institution worked, but old enough to notice when something felt different. Anyone who has watched the royal family over the past 6 years knows what Louis is like. He's the kid who brings life into every quiet room. He struggles to sit still during ceremonies. He pulls funny faces. He asks endless questions. He fills every moment with energy. His playful expressions have ended up on newspaper front pages, looking like they would have made his late great-grandmother raise an eyebrow. But then everything changed. As the youngest of the 3 children, Louis was never expected to carry the same weight as George or Charlotte. People talked about George's future. They discussed Charlotte's role, but Louis was simply allowed to enjoy being a child. That was one of the kindest decisions his parents ever made. But it also meant nobody had prepared him for what was about to happen. One day, he simply stopped going to places. No one fully explained why. What he noticed wasn't a meeting or a difficult conversation. It was something much quieter. The house became quieter. The adults lowered their voices. The atmosphere changed. Little by little, even Louis could feel that something wasn't right. And that growing silence led to the night when everything finally came to the surface. It happened after the children had gone to bed, and it was a private conversation between William and Catherine. Catherine had written her own statement by hand over several sessions. On sheets of paper, she placed those pages on the table in front of William and asked him to read them. Right beside her handwritten pages was the palace's official draft. And this is where the story gets really interesting. A palace-approved statement is carefully written by royal advisors before it's released to the public. Every word is chosen with great care. The goal is to say just enough without creating new questions or starting fresh headlines. But Catherine felt something was missing. To her, those carefully written words felt empty. They talked about the situation without admitting how frightening it had really been. They spoke about things getting better, but never explained what the family had actually gone through. The statement sounded safe, but it did not sound real, and that was the part she simply could not accept. William read the first line of Catherine's version. Before he even reached the second line, he shook his head. He reminded her that once a message is made public, it never truly disappears. It can be shared again and again, picked apart, and quoted for years. He asked if she was ready to see people who had never even met Louis talking about him for the rest of his life. As he spoke, his voice became louder, but halfway through his sentence, he suddenly stopped. That was the moment they both realized something. The anger they were hearing was not really anger at all. It was fear hiding behind strong words. Even so, Catherine refused to back down. And this is where the whole conversation took an unexpected turn. She quietly told William that Louis had started believing he was being kept away from the public because his family was ashamed of him. Think about that for a second. Not because he was sick, not because anything was wrong with him, but because at just 8 years old, he had noticed that he was always the one who stayed behind. He saw everyone else going out while he remained at home. No one explained why. Whenever he walked into a room, conversations suddenly changed. People became quieter. Like many children would, he filled in the missing pieces himself. A child who is never given an answer will usually create one. The answer Louis created was heartbreaking. He convinced himself that he was the problem that was the painful result of years of trying to protect him. The very plan meant to keep him safe had slowly made him question his own worth. Catherine then pushed the palace's official draft across the table. She told William there was nothing in those carefully chosen words that sounded anything like the little boy they had nearly watched lose confidence in himself. And that was not all. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had also been affected. George had started paying attention to every closed door in the house. Charlotte had learned to lower her voice whenever Louis was mentioned. She had even begun leaving little jokes on his bed because she had figured out by herself that making him laugh helped bring back the happy brothers she knew. So that night, William and Catherine finally reached an important turning point together. Catherine would speak out, but only to a certain point. She had no intention of sharing every private detail of what their family had been through. At the same time, she was no longer willing to pretend that the past several months had been easy. And that is when everything started to change. Even after they agreed on what they wanted to say, there was still one person who had the power to stop the entire statement. Ironically, he was also the one person in the family who truly understood what they were going through. That person was King Charles. Later that evening, Charles received the draft after one of his regular briefings. Before reading it, he quietly asked everyone else to leave the room. Then he sat alone and carefully read every page. When he finished, he went back and read it all over again. But then something caught his attention. He reached the line that talked about a child confusing privacy with shame. He slowly took off his glasses, placed them on the desk, and sat there for several moments without touching them again. There was a reason that sentence affected him so deeply. Charles had spent his entire life inside a royal system that teaches people to hide their feelings before they are even old enough to understand what that kind of silence can cost. He learned that lesson as a child. Later, he passed the same lesson on to his own sons, and as the world knows, one of those sons has spent the last 20 years speaking openly about the emotional damage that approach caused. And this is where the conversation became even more serious. Charles asked his son just one question: was this statement truly meant to help Prince Louis, or was it simply making the adults around him feel better? It was a difficult question to hear, but it was also the right one. Every family believes it is protecting its child during hard times, but sometimes, without realizing it, the adults are actually protecting themselves from having to say painful things out loud. But there was one important difference. They had removed the part where Prince Louis thanked the people who had supported him. In fact, they had taken out the only sentence in the entire statement that truly sounded like it came from the young prince himself. And that became the deciding moment. Charles refused to approve the edited version. According to someone who witnessed the discussion, the king believed that removing Louis's own words might protect the monarchy, but it would fail the child at the center of the story. And that's really the entire system, all the advisors, all the carefully worded statements, all the 10-year plans and media strategies, they were designed to protect the monarchy. But somewhere along the way, protecting the monarchy and protecting the child became two different things. The silence that was supposed to keep Louis safe ended up making him feel isolated. The privacy that was supposed to shield him from public scrutiny ended up making him question whether he was loved. And the adults in the room, all of them well-intentioned, all of them genuinely trying to do the right thing, ended up creating the exact outcome they were trying to avoid. Not because they didn't care, but because they were so focused on controlling the story that they forgot to explain it to the one person who needed to hear it most, an 8-year-old boy who just wanted to know that he wasn't the problem. That's the part that makes the tears make sense. That's the part that makes the whole thing feel real. And that's the part that's going to stay with people long after the headlines fade. And if you look closely at the way Catherine handled the actual recording, you can see how carefully she balanced two completely different responsibilities. On one side, she was speaking as a mother who had watched her youngest child slowly withdraw into himself. On the other side, she was speaking as a senior member of the royal family who knew every word would be analyzed for years. She didn't mention specific incidents. She didn't describe private conversations in detail. She didn't give the press a single quote they could twist into a damaging headline. But she also didn't hide behind phrases like difficult period or challenging time without explaining why. She named the emotion. She said the word shame. She described what it looked like when a child believes he is the reason his family is hiding him. That's not a standard royal communication. That's a mother drawing one clear line between what the public deserves to know and what her son deserves to keep private. And the response from the public was immediate. People who had spent months speculating about Louis suddenly went quiet. The jokes stopped, the theories stopped, the comment sections that had been full of wild guesses turned into something closer to collective guilt, because until that moment, most people hadn't considered what their curiosity might feel like from the inside. They hadn't thought about what it would be like to be 8 years old and realize that strangers were asking why you weren't showing up. They hadn't imagined what it would feel like to walk past the television and hear your own name being discussed in tones usually reserved for bad news. Catherine's statement didn't just explain what had been happening. It forced people to sit with their own role in it, and that's a much harder thing to do than simply saying leave him alone. There's also something important in the way William eventually supported the decision. He didn't issue his own statement. He didn't stand beside Catherine in front of the cameras or add his own words to the release. He let her speak, and then he stayed quiet. For a man who has spent most of his adult life trying to control every narrative around his family, that was a significant shift. It suggested that he understood something he hadn't fully accepted before. You can't always protect your children by saying nothing. Sometimes the most protective thing you can do is tell the truth in a way that leaves no room for anyone else to invent a worse version. William has always been afraid of what happens when private pain becomes public property. But in this case, he seems to have realized that the silence had already made Louis's pain public. The only difference was that the public version was wrong. And for Louis himself, the hope is that this becomes the moment everything starts to turn around. Children are resilient, but they're also deeply observant. He will remember the months when he thought he was the problem. He will remember the feeling of walking into a room and watching adults change the subject. But he will also remember that his mother eventually sat down in front of a camera and told the world that he was loved, that he was not the problem, and that his family had never been ashamed of him. That's a powerful thing for any child to hear, even if it happens in a way that's far more public than anyone would choose. And if the palace is careful, if the advisors learn the right lesson from all of this, then maybe the next few months will be about something other than damage control. Maybe they'll be about rebuilding trust, not just between the family and the public, but between Louis and the people who love him most. Because at the end of the day, that's what this story is actually about. Not the monarchy, not the media, not the strategy meetings or the carefully worded statements. It's about a little boy who spent months believing something that wasn't true, and the moment his mother finally said it out loud so he could hear it too. The tears weren't for the cameras, they weren't for public sympathy, they were for Louis, and if there's any justice in the way this plays out, he'll never have to